Nersisyan, who's a professor at Franklin Marshall College and an associate at the Levy Economics Institute. Mark Paul from Duke University, and Voracek, who graduated from the Levy Master's Program and is on to greener pastures. So we begin with Rosen Ivanov on the Eurozone job guarantee.
Good morning. Thanks very much, Pavlina. I'm really happy to be here to discuss all these, especially the merits of a job guarantee, which I found to have merits in its own right, even in a normal, just logical framework. So I'm going to make the arguments for a Eurozone job guarantee. So it's mostly I'm facing why it is a good idea, not really the design because we don't have time anyway. But I think it's something that should complete nicely the monetary, economic, and social union. I think this can be an overarching policy which would be pretty good, I think, for the circumstances of the Eurozone. So yeah, the usual disclaimer applies, so this is just my own personal views and not related to my employer. So the plan is really to see what are the problems and really in the Eurozone which are more specific, and then to outline a number of arguments why a Eurozone job guarantee is a good idea. And then probably one slide just for possible implementation of a Eurozone job guarantee, what it would take to have one. So as you can see from this graph, things are pretty not so bad. I mean, they're not too good, but either. But you can see that the average unemployment in the EU is lower than in the Eurozone. So it seems that there is some kind of a problem. But so it seems that the Eurozone somehow lags behind in employment. And actually, if you look at the arithmetic averages of unemployment, the non-euro area, which is here, and the euro area, so it becomes even much clearer that there is a problem, a lot of heterogeneity, of course, in the Eurozone, but there is an unemployment problem which is bigger in the Eurozone than in non-euro area countries. Then, with regards to poverty, also you can see that the difference, the increase in poverty is mainly in the Eurozone. Spain, Italy, Greece, Netherlands, Sweden, even. So it seems that there is an increase also in poverty by 5.5 million people in the Eurozone, while there is a decrease in non-euro area countries. So, and there are very ambitious targets of the EU that they want really to cut. The official target was really to cut unemployment by 2020 by 20 million. So we are now behind even the initial stage. So there is a case for something to be done on poverty and on unemployment in the Eurozone, basically. And actually, there was a poll done by Eurobarometer, and it shows also that there is a strong popular mandate to do something on poverty, on unemployment and social policy. 7 out of 10 Europeans consider that they are poorly managed and would favor decision making both at the level of at the national and EU level. And also, yeah, so there is people really want that the countries and also the institutions put their act together and do something. And also this mandate is also enshrined in the EU treaties. I mean, there is a objective of full employment and there is a social inclusion. So clearly there is a popular mandate, there is a mandate in the treaty, so something can be done. And what I argue is that a good proposal would be to have a Eurozone job guarantee, a scheme that, let's say, that it would directly create, the national governments would directly create and offer jobs paying living wages or minimum salary to all eligible unemployed citizens who are willing to take the offer. So it should be voluntary and so on. So it's really, if we start from there, we can see what is the current state with regards to that, because there is some direct job creation being done in the EU countries. And furthermore, there is the youth guarantee. So up to 25, all the people who are less than 25 years of age, the government in 2013 all the EU governments agreed to institute a so-called youth guarantee. So it's a kind of a recommendation, but it's a strong thing that all the governments should do it. The thing is, it's agreed, but it is not done. And the thing is also another thing to remember is that Eurofund, it's an agency to help with labor policies, found out, they did the analysis and they said, okay, the cost would be like, back in 2012, to do that would be like 50 billion, but actually the benefits would be 160 billion. So even the official agency of the EU, they're saying, look guys, actually you are net much better off at an annual basis. So these are their calculations. And nevertheless, this has not been done. So it seems that there is a problem, and most of the problems, they stem of course from lack of funding. Lack of funding because the national governments, they would not have the funds to prioritize this policy. Let's say some kind of inertia. But then also is the restriction of the Stability and Growth Pact. Because even in Sweden, there were some funds, also common funds, like 7 billion, but that's just for the whole period up to 2020 that were provided. But and they were provided even in Sweden, a country which seems that shouldn't have these problems, but because the youth guarantee, these funds are provided for regions which have structurally very high employment, more than 25%. So they were eligible to get 100 million back in 2014. In the end, the government decided to freeze this funding for that year because they were afraid that they would break the 3% debt limit. So it's kind of a situation where really the Stability and Growth Pact is a problem to do that. So, but overall, an average of less than 0.1% of GDP goes for direct job creation in the EU countries. Here you see that Hungary actually has the biggest share of those kind of problems. But I found that Hungary, and also to a much lesser extent France and Ireland, who have relatively bigger direct job creation problems, they do better at poverty reduction and also fighting unemployment. So compared to other countries with similar situation, size, and so on, it seems that there is something there. And I will show you actually the figures for Hungary are pretty impressive. And but let's start with the arguments. Let's go quickly through the arguments. And I really hear the biggest argument is really that this is really actually job guarantee is so much more in line with the original Keynes intent for fiscal stabilization, because job guarantee would target full employment. It would not target aggregate demand, which Pavlina has made a big case out of that. She showed it. She shows this very well in her paper on reorienting fiscal policy, both from theoretical and practical perspective. So it's really a different class of fiscal policy. It's totally different. It's not just fiscal policy. So you really have a different target. You operate differently. So it's not just some inefficient fiscal spending, but she shows it very well. And actually, if you do it, actually you by the very objective, you make possible full employment in a narrow sense, up to 1 or 2%. So within the frictional part of unemployment, people just who don't really want to take an offer, but just looking for some change. Then also you enable the growth closer to potential output, because with these policies, even Keynes acknowledged that all kinds of theoretical calculation of potential output, they're kind of imposters. So actually, in fact, the more people work, the closer you are to potential output. So this is what this policy would make. And of course, this is a bottom-up policy. It's not a trickle-down policy, which actually you address the inequality problem very targeted way. So you don't have like the remains going to the most poor people, but you have the remains going to some of the richer people. So it's totally different, and I think it addresses, and it has been shown where it has been applied, especially in Argentina, that within months they could, let's say, reduce extreme poverty by 25% or things like that. It's really very quick and effective with that. And then also it addresses the emerging challenges of working life, where actually work is becoming more precarious, You need you have shorter periods with some employer rather than others. So it's kind of you need some kind of a safety net to help you move from one job to another. And I think this is the perfect thing. As an automatic stabilizer promoting price stability, I will not speak because a lot of people have spoken on that. It's very and for lack of time, I will go to the next slides. So now I have three quantitative arguments for the Eurozone job guarantee. I did the calculations. So let's say if we assume, let's say it's an assumption, that if we institute this program, there would be 8 million people would decide to enroll. Then indirectly, it would lead to another 900,000 people. Then it would lead to a reduction of unemployment in the Eurozone from 9.1 to 3.6%. So what is the expected cost with using a floor of 450 euros? Because it doesn't make much of a difference if you have it, because it's only for the Baltic countries and Slovakia, I think. So the salaries would be in the order of 100 billion euros. If we add 10% to that to equipment, and for administration, for all practical purposes, I just don't add anything because, okay, there would be some movement from other programs, so I assume that the administration would be flexible, so they would just be moved to that kind of thing. But anyway, the costs there are not that big. So altogether, you have a gross cost for the euro area of 1% of GDP. And that's a gross cost, but if you take out the income support and maintenance funds, which normally these people have been receiving prior to being enrolled in the program, actually you get to 0.37% of GDP. And I don't count here the additional tax and so on. I'm very conservative with this. I think it could be even like it's kind of paying for itself almost. Like probably could be reduced by 80% the gross cost. But I just take the direct effects. I'm very conservative with this estimate. So you can see here that, okay, even if we hire more people, it seems that to get a reduction of unemployment of 5.5 percentage points, it seems that a gross cost of 1% of GDP. I think it's a very good price to get this, and even on a net basis, it's even much lower. So this is the first quantitative argument. The second one is I want to discuss the multiplier. I think this is a big selling point also for this program from fiscal sustainability perspective, because actually by design we know that the multiplier depends on the marginal propensity to consume, on the marginal tax rate, and the marginal propensity to import. By default, the poor people would self-select themselves into this program. So for them, you have the highest marginal propensity to consume, the lowest marginal tax rate, and the lowest marginal propensity to import. I think we can safely agree on this. So by default, for this type of program, you have a multiplier which should be higher than any other, I guess, this is in my understanding, from all the other kind of fiscal policies expenditures. So this is I think a strong point. And also as a stabilization tool, we have to know that the multiplier is really higher in recessions and at zero low bound. There is a lot of literature on that. So on top of that, in recessions and zero low bound, you have even higher multiplier in principle. So there are some estimates for Greece, and this is the general estimate is 1.667. Then the IMF calculated 1.7. The revised estimate initially when they launched the program was 1%. For Greece, but then they realized okay, it was 1.7. So and then it can be higher. People who have made a proposal for a Greek plan for a job guarantee have calculated it may be 2.32, and also actually for Argentina, where there was a real program, it was calculated that it was 2.57, which is quite a good figure. And based on these estimates, we go to the third argument, which is also very interesting, where Watson and some friends and some co-authors, they derived a condition under which actually the expenditures for the Eurozone job guarantee program would lead to a decrease of the debt to GDP ratio immediately in the same year. And you can see that this depends mostly from the multiplier. So the multiplier is really dominating the whole thing. So the higher it is, actually, at the lower level of debt, you will have a positive effect on debt to GDP ratio. And there are some calculations for Greece where the debt to GDP ratio was really high. But then if you take various numbers for the multiplier, even the initial estimate of IMF of 1, then you find out that actually it makes sense that you do a job guarantee because you would improve fiscal sustainability measured as a debt to GDP in all scenarios. And then what is the case? Could it be that a natural follow-up to that is really that such a program should be imposed even as a condition for restoring fiscal sustainability? It seems there is a strong case, especially for highly indebted countries. So it's really kind of counterintuitive, but I think the math is sound normally. So yeah, something to consider. So some other bit more specific Eurozone arguments. Okay, now the Commission the Commission and the presidents of the institutions, they were back in 2015. They had some ideas that they need some stabilization tool for the Eurozone, and I thought that the Eurozone job guarantee could be a very good candidate for such a macroeconomic stabilization function for the euro area, based on all what we talked also before. Then Eurozone job guarantee can complement the monetary policy in the euro area because, okay, the monetary policy in the euro area is on the aggregate okay for the euro area, but the different countries, the Eurozone job guarantee would allow variations in different countries with aggregate demand and so on. So I think this is a nice complement to the overall monetary policy of the euro area. And then a Eurozone job guarantee can be an effective instrument for convergence and regional policies because a lot of people, if they had the jobs there at their place, they would not move out, and then the regions would be better off developed, and there would not be this moving to the countries with higher activity. Then, if you have, let's say, a minimum basis salary for the Eurozone, I mean, we allow in my calculation, I allow the minimum salaries to vary in different countries, but you have an absolute floor. Probably this would increase the attractiveness of other euro area, non-euro area countries to join because they would see a clear benefit. Also, that there would be a floor there if you are in the Eurozone and you really enjoy certain rights. You have effective salaries, effective minimum salary actually. And then I would argue that now is the right time to initiate a Eurozone job guarantee because now it seems that the cost will not be so big. You already have reduced employment a lot. So maybe now it's really a structural component of unemployment which you may want to address when now in good times, yeah, and then you'd be much better prepared if there are bad times to already do it now so that you're prepared if something bad happens. And also it would increase the potential of people to get employed, like moving them from structurally unemployed to employed in this program and probably employed in private employment. Because especially in good times also, people are much likely to, yeah, also the private sector probably would react more forcefully. And also we have the zero lower bound still. So the multiplier must be really high also now. Also the financing, if it was via debt issuance, it would be also, now it's relatively cheap, I would say. So I thought that this is a good time to initiate such a proposal. So, but does this work? Does this work? Will this work? And then I found the numbers for Hungary, who have made a interesting significant increase in their direct job creation program by hiring 150,000 people, and then the cost is really 3/4% of GDP. And it's the highest of all, as you have seen, of what people are doing, and they are running deficits all the time. So what happens is you have the reduction by 150,000 of joblessness, so by 30%, and then you have actually some kind of multiplier, perhaps, but I have to see the data. I don't have the data why it further decreased in the next 2 years to 4.3%. So it's very effective in lowering unemployment. And then also you see that it increases people, decreased people in poverty. For every person who was employed, it seems that 3.6 people, they got out of poverty. So this is a very significant result, I think. And also the other thing about fiscal sustainability, knowing that the direct job creation would contribute like 30% to the cumulative deficits. So in the end, you see that the debt to GDP ratio also decreases by 3.5%. So it's kind of percentage points. Sorry. So it seems that this is working. This can work basically, and it's kind of confirmation for all the arguments. So how it can be done? First, there should be a political agreement between the member states that this is an overarching policy that should be implemented by all. And then they would need actually to consider that the expenditures under this program are contributing to the long-term fiscal sustainability. There is a clause there in the Stability and Growth Pact that for such expenditures which are contributing to fiscal sustainability, they can be excluded from calculating the deficit for the purpose of the excessive deficit procedure. So they just have to agree that all the expenditures for this would qualify there. And that would lose the hands of governments to really invest there. And then they need to agree on some harmonized common features so that it does not mess too much with the free movement of people. You don't create some artificial movements between countries and so on. And the fourth thing is you have to find the financing, the funding. But you have to ensure that they're able to fund this at all times, fully. So whoever wants to show up for work, that he's able to be funded. And there are a number of ways to do that. I think own resources are a possibility. Actually, by launching the job guarantee, you see that you're saving a lot from your own expenditures. So you already use some of your own resources. And even if you add another tax to finance this, Murray has shown, running a model, that actually you would improve the fiscal sustainability also in this scenario, even if you add a tax to do that. Other sources of funding are the common funds for the Euro area, EU funds, which we have seen there is some funding. If we see that this is an overarching EU policy. And another interesting thing is for the Eurozone, they could use the seigniorage, because the argument can go like this. Okay, seigniorage is a bit higher because now we have the euro, it has become a significant currency, so therefore we have a higher level of seigniorage. And then, okay, but there is the negative externality that actually we don't have, it's not country-specific, this monetary policy, but it's an overarching monetary policy, so you need somehow to counter this, and then you use the funds, the additional funds coming from the seigniorage, just to do that with the job guarantee. So I think, and seigniorage was shown by a so-called high-level group on own resources by the European Commission that it's a potential way to use common financing for certain projects. And then another thing is, of course, debt. So what I'm arguing here is that, okay, countries, I mean, they should finance this by, if they don't have the funds, to issue debt. And they can do that at their own, with their own bonds. But also what is interesting, the European Commission is proposing in their reflection paper to issue sovereign-backed, bond-backed securities, which are non-mutualized securities. But let's say you issue one bond, which actually is part of all the different bonds. It somehow securitized the sovereign bonds. And they're arguing that this is a good way to diversify for all the banks that they may wish to invest in such types of bonds instead of the individual ones. So it's not mutualized this one, it's a possibility, I think, and could be that in the end it's somehow there is a bit lower funding for this, or you could have a mutualized source for this program where the Commission again is proposing to have a European safe asset, but of course it would take some time until we get there. And then what is important, I think, for this is to ensure that even during stress, the Euro system would support this kind of issuance for funding the Eurozone job guarantee. Because then it's similar to outright monetary transactions, what they are doing now to save countries, but now for the Eurozone job guarantee. So, but this is what I wanted to say. I mean, basically, the European Commission has said it's time to put pragmatism before dogma. So just putting all these pieces together, bits and pieces, I think this is a good thing to do for the Eurozone.
Thank you, Rosen. Next up, we have Yeva and Nersisyan from Franklin Marshall College and Levy Economics Institute. The economic possibilities of grandchildren.
Can you give me a warning when I have 5 minutes left?
Yes, I will.
Okay. Turn it off. Okay. All right. So it's probably too early for me to talk about grandchildren because I don't have any. But you know what I wanted to do here, and at this point this is not a paper, just thoughts, just to do what Keynes did in his 1931 essay, The Economic Possibilities for Our Grandchildren, just to sort of take a look ahead, and in Keynes's case it was 100 years ahead, and just to see like what kind of economy we want to imagine, you know, to have sort of think of a vision for the economy. And for that, I think it was a good idea to go back to Keynes. I was always sort of fascinated by this essay because he wrote it in 1931, so you know, after the Great Depression, things are really going bad, and he has this optimistic view about the future. So he's saying that the mankind is solving its economic problem, and by that he means the problem of subsistence. So for as long as humans have existed, we've had the problem of subsistence, right? How we're going to make a living, how we're going to, you know, find the food and whatever else it is that we need. And he's saying that problem is going to be solved in like 100 years, and our standard of living is going to increase by 4 to 8 times. And at that point, he says, we will be confronted with the problem of what do we do with our time? And it seems that today, in a sense, we are close to that, right? We're talking yesterday night, we were talking about like robots taking over and doing the work, and then what do we do with our time? And Keynes says that is his permanent problem. How do you occupy yourself when, you know, and when you have so much leisure time? And he says, you know, how do we not have a nervous breakdown as a society, like just like the rich housewives had when we had all this machines sort of taking over the work that they were doing, you know? And so he says, well, we still will want to work because I think it's an argument that Veblen makes. We have this instinct of workmanship, right? As humans, we need to do something productive. But he says we only need to work like 3 hours a day or 15 hours a week, something like that. And you know, that would be a nice thing. And at that point, he says everybody's needs will be provided, and by needs he means, you know, really needs rather than wants, in the sense that wants are about sort of wanting to be better than, have more than other people, so that we feel like we're better than other people. And at that point, some people are still going to try to accumulate a lot of money, but at that point, we will see these people or this money-making motive for what it is, right? So he says before that, it's a good thing, right, the money-making motive, because it leads to these developments, but once we're there, we can provide for everybody, then, you know, this becomes immoral, sort of, the immoral you know, motivation. Anyways, so, and then in chapter 24 of the general theory, he talks about socialization of investment as a way to tackle unemployment. He's not really clear what that means. It is clear that he doesn't mean we want, you know, socialism, right? That part is clear. But he says we need to socialize investment to solve the problems of inequality and unemployment. So basically keep it at the full employment level, right? It's about the sort of quantity of investment. And then but the other side of it is that if you invest, you're building factories, right? You're investing in plant and equipment. You're supporting the capital development of the economy, which is what is going to get us to this state, right, where we can provide for everybody's needs. So we need to invest to increase capital and productivity so that we can get to this state where we only have to work 3 hours a day, something like that, or we can work 3 hours a day. But of course, today it seems like where Keynes saw possibilities, we see problems, right? That machines are taking away our jobs, and we somehow want those jobs back, and that's a problem, right? That robots are going to be flipping burgers, as if flipping burgers is such a nice thing to do, or like we want the coal mining jobs back because we want to mine coal, like it's such a good job as work, right? Not as far as pay goes and so on. So instead of thinking about how we create better jobs, we just want the crappy jobs back, and it's of course completely the wrong way to go about it, and probably Keynes would say that is the wrong way to go about it. So, well, why is this happening? I think the reason why we want those jobs back is because we have this idea that we just need to rely on the private sector, right, to create the jobs. So as Bill Mitchell said, we don't think of the state as a producer anymore, right? It's just a consumer, and as a consumer, it can do very much, or at least that's the thinking. But of course, the private sector has not been doing the job of capital development, right? If you look at investment has been very sluggish since the Great Recession, and perhaps even before that. And of course, that's what we need to support the capital development of the economy. So if you look at the U.S., and the U.S. isn't the worst case, of course, here. The laser pointer is working, but it's somewhere in the middle there, and the pink bars show how far investment, like how much investment decreased during the recession from the 2007 levels, and the maximum decrease for the U.S. was 20%, and then the investment to GDP ratio, right, the change from December 2007 to December 2014, those are the blue dots. So after so many years only, we came back to the same level of investment that we had prior to the recession. And of course, that's a problem. It means we're not doing the job of capital development very well. Productivity, of course, hasn't been growing, which is another important aspect of the problem if we want to be able to provide for everybody. And you can see how low productivity growth has been since the recession. And it's not surprising because we tend to think of productivity as an individual worker characteristic, but that's of course not true. It depends on the capital, right? The kind of capital you're working with, and we're not investing, so it's not surprising that productivity is not growing. Now, the public sector, of course, has not picked up the slack, right? Public investment is moribund. But the one reason why the private sector is not investing is the fact that we have this what Randy Ray, well, what Minsky calls money management capitalism, and Randy Ray and Mariana Mazzucato did a paper on this, talking about how capital development doesn't occur very well under this new regime of capitalism, right? So the private sector is investing. Part of the reason is because there isn't enough aggregate demand, but the other part is that because they have different priorities now, right? They need to meet their short-term earnings targets set by Wall Street analysts by any means, even if that means that they need to cut investment. So this is what Lazonic and O'Sullivan, in their very important contribution, which has been cited like 1,000 times, called the movement away from retain and reinvest model to downsize and distribute. So instead of retaining the earnings and reinvesting them, corporations are distributing their earnings in the form of dividends or engaging in stock buybacks and downsizing their workforce. Okay, so a very recent study that they did showed that the pharmaceutical companies who justify high drug prices by saying we invest in research and development, that's why we have to keep prices high, show that they actually spend more on buying back their stocks and paying out dividends than on research and development. But the problem is that with what's called the Nikification of the American corporation, is that even when companies do invest, they no longer create the jobs that we've come to expect of them. So, a job that provides a blue-collar worker with with a good living, right? Decent jobs. They no longer create them because what companies do is that they do the high value-added activities here in the U.S. and then they outsource the rest. So, as far as branding, advertising, those things, right? They will do them here in the U.S. and therefore create jobs for highly skilled workers. But then the assembly will be shipped to China, or now I guess it's moving from China to other countries. So that's why we have companies that have really large market capitalizations, but they're very small in terms of assets and employment. Apple, market capitalization 810 billion, and it only has 47,000 employees. So it only directly employs 47,000 people. And Google, something similar, and that's true of many large corporations these days. So in a sense, the corporation is no longer the conduit for long-term sustainable employment or access to middle-class, life. And of course, this is what people want to bring back, right? And they say, well, we need to bring back these kinds of jobs, and they're not coming back. And even when companies invest, they're not going to create these kinds of jobs. So, there is the issue, of course, of outsourcing and robots, and instead of thinking of how do we go forward, we're looking backward, and that's the wrong way to go about it. So my argument here is that we need to think of the job guarantee as something more than just a stabilization policy. So it's not just about maintaining aggregate demand at the right level to ensure full employment. So it is a targeted demand policy, right, as Pavlina has very convincingly argued, and that's consistent with what Keynes would want. But I think it also provides a way to rethink and restructure our economy. So to think about what are some of the areas that we want to develop, like renewable energies, for instance. Right? And Fidel was talking about that too yesterday in his presentation, that you need to sort of, especially if you're thinking about developing countries, you need to see where the issues are, right? So, food sustainability or sufficiency, right, would be important for developing countries, and that's where you have to sort of direct the investment. So in this sense, this goes against what Keynes would say, at least seems like, right, that for him, socializing investment was really about the quantity rather than the government directing where investment is going. But I think we, at this point, have to move away from that and think about that we have to think about the direction of investment. And the job guarantee provides a good conduit for that. And climate change, as terrible as it is, and thinking about grandchildren, of course, or children even, that's an important issue. But I think it allows us to rethink and reimagine our economy. And Naomi Klein makes this good point in her book, This Changes Everything, that conservatives recognize the true implications of climate change, which is that the current model of capitalism is not compatible with the climate. And they realize that if once you admit that there is climate change, we need a wholesale rethinking of our economy, and that's what they do not want, right? But the problem with, and recently she was giving a talk at Franklin and Marshall, and she was talking about how we do need a different vision for the economy, so going back to what Keynes is doing in the 1931 essay, and that how we've had this neoliberal assault on our imagination, that there is no alternative, the end of history, that we can't imagine a different future. But I think environmentalists, and of course she's associated with the environmental movements, various environmental movements, they don't seem to be able to envision a different future either, because they think about how are we going to pay for all of this, right? And they think about what Stephanie Kelton was saying yesterday, we need to stick it to the rich, right? We need to stick it to the oil companies. Oil companies are the ones who polluted, so we need to make them pay. Well, we can't wait for that, right? We can't wait for oil companies to pay for solving the problems of climate change and cleanup and so on. And once you understand that the government is not financially constrained, then you can reimagine a different economic future, and our economic possibilities, right? What is economically possible change completely. So I think MMT allows us to imagine a more sustainable economy. without like how are we going to pay for it problems. All right. So I think the one thing about job guarantee that we need to emphasize more is that it completely changes the policy calculus, right? So for instance, the whole thing about the Keystone Access pipeline, right, that Obama said no and Trump said yes. Well, how many jobs is it going to create? 3,900 direct construction jobs over 1 year. If it's built over 2, it's 100, 1,950. Once it's open, it's only 35 full-time jobs and 15 full-time temporary jobs. And then there are the additional jobs that will be created. As a macroeconomist, I look at this and I say, well, this is not many jobs at all, right? And of course, the climate scientist, James Hansen, has said that if we exploit the Canadian tar sands oil, this is game over for climate change, and that's what Keystone Access is about doing, right? But once we have a job guarantee, we won't say let's build a pipeline because it's going to create 35 full-time jobs or 42,000 indirect jobs, which are going to pay something around less than the median income, right? So it changes the calculus. Like we won't say let's build pipelines because they create jobs, and let's mine coal because it creates jobs. We said there is an alternative, right? So if you want to stay in your hometown and work on building, say, wind turbines, you can do that. You don't have to move to like an oil rig and work and be far away from your family. And of course, rigs explode occasionally, right? And take the chance of all of that. So, and therefore all of this. One other thing that Naomi Klein mentioned, which was very striking, is that the coal miners were always like opposed to the coal mine owners, like they hated each other, right? But right now their interests are like the same. You can't tell the difference between coal miners and coal mine owners. It's like they are pushing for the same thing, right? When it doesn't have to be that way. Anyways, so with a job guarantee, we wouldn't fear technical progress anymore, right? A technical progress that destroys the mundane jobs. Instead, we can do what Keynes was talking about, right? Like, write poetry, watch ballet, and other things, garden, right? Grow our own food, whatever it is that we want to do. We would not want the jobs back from China, and so on and so forth. And Mariana Mazzucato, who wrote the book The Entrepreneurial State, I think she makes a case that every major investment, every major innovation can be traced back to government, government funding. So in that sense, it's not unusual to say we want the government to fund the renewable energy industry because the private sector cannot make that, right? So people talk about how like Tesla is running rockets into the space and they're doing it better than the government. Like, yeah, but they did not develop the technology of running rockets into space, right? Maybe they took and ran with it and maybe made the technology better, but they're not the ones who started it. So I think a strong case can be made for why the government should be the entity to invest in the renewable energies and create jobs along the way. All right, the last thing that I wanted to talk about is that there is a stereotype that job guarantee jobs have to be this sort of low-skill kind of jobs. And I was doing a presentation in June in Italy, and somebody was like, yeah, but how, if we don't bring the manufacturing jobs, we're like, what are we gonna do? We're just gonna create this low-skill, bad jobs through a job guarantee. I'm like, they don't have to be low-skill or bad jobs, right? And they don't have to be just, care work kinds of jobs that people often tend to associate, although that's, I think, I would argue that's very important, partly because care work has very low carbon footprint, but also because of how it helps redefine, what is valuable work and so on and so forth. So, the job guarantee jobs will be better alternatives. I think we can think of better jobs to replace the manufacturing jobs, because today we sort of idealize the manufacturing jobs, but they were not, as far as the nature of work goes, they were not good jobs, right? Maybe they paid well, but that doesn't make them necessarily good work for humans to do, right? Anyways, but at the same time, you can look at how the WPA was implemented in the US, and of course there was a lot of construction work that was done, but at the same time you had artists who were employed, you had historical restoration, archaeological work, and workers were employed doing those things. If you haven't visited this website, The Living New Deal, I encourage you to go and look. It's amazing. You know, there are pictures of all the sites, not all the sites, but a bunch of the sites that were built through the WPA, and a lot of, you know, the work that was done, like the mosaics, mural sculptures, you can see them all there. And I guess people can continuously add things. That's why it's called The Living New Deal, right? Add pictures and information about various projects that were completed. So I think we can also think of the job guarantee as helping us redefine what is work, right? And what is valuable work. So for instance, I mentioned care work, and I think Pavlina and others have done work talking about how you can design a job guarantee in a way, especially for developing countries, that will have a major impact as far as gender roles goes and so on. You know, you could have part-time jobs if that's what, like the availability of part-time jobs, because maybe some people do not want to work full-time, but they can't, you know, find sort of flexible jobs, you know, work from home, all sorts of things that we can imagine that could be possible. All right, I'll stop right here and.
Okay, next up we have Mark Paul from Duke University, and he will be talking to us on a 21st century economic bill of human rights, economic rights.
How's everybody doing this morning? Thanks for joining us on a Sunday morning, last day of this fantastic conference. Really happy to be here with all of you. So today I want to talk about what an economic bill of rights could look like in the 21st century. So specifically, we've talked a tremendous amount about the job guarantee here at this conference. And the job guarantee is an idea that has been gaining a lot of traction, both in the popular media as well as starting to gain a little bit of traction in DC, which I think is really exciting. However, I also think we need to think broader about what a progressive agenda and progressive economics looks like. The job guarantee, I think, is a vital component of that. However, I think it's a component of that. And I think we need a broader agenda than this simple one policy and touting it to some degree as a policy that's a silver bullet. I think it's the right policy to start with in terms of what reorienting economic rights could look like and the right to a job. While I don't necessarily want to fight the battle of reclaiming right to work, but I think, you know, putting it within that framing is quite important. But I'm here today to really talk to you about trying to develop a broader vision for progressive economics and what are the things that I think we should be talking about as economic rights, civil rights, and basic rights of individuals that are living in this country. So state of affairs, I won't spend too much time here today on, but we know that we're currently living in an economy that is creating broad growth, but is not creating shared prosperity and not creating reasonable livelihoods for everybody that's currently in the United States. The economic mobility has basically collapsed. Chetty has done some fantastic work on this, as all of, or many of us are in universities. If you haven't checked out his great database that him and his co-authors have built, showing economic mobility by university and how much different universities have helped bring up kids into the middle and quality middle class livelihoods. I really encourage you to look at it, especially for those of you at state schools that might be facing funding cuts. It's a great way to show that, you know, your school is doing vital work in serving this, you know, the citizens of this country, moving them from lower class to middle class and so on and so forth. But by and large, economic mobility has nearly collapsed in the U.S. I mean, not that it's ever been terribly robust. It's mainly, to some degree, been this fantastic myth that we've developed. However, it's continued to decline what little there was. The bottom half of the population basically hasn't seen any income growth in the past 50 years, and I'll show you a great chart in a moment by Piketty and his co-authors. And we know that despite we have more things than what we know what to do with, we still have 40 million people living in poverty, and we have over 10 million that are living in $2 a day poverty. I mean, when we used to talk about $2 a day poverty, we're talking about, we're talking about developing countries. We're talking about Africa. This is something we talk about I worked at the UN Development Bank for a while, and that's the goal we're always talking about. And I come home after my year in Ethiopia at the bank, And I realized, I started looking at the statistics, and I'm like, wait a second, we have a vast $2 a day poverty problem here at home. But this is simply a distributional question, right? This isn't necessarily about growth. This is a distributional question. And that's the key aspect that I want to focus on here today. So this is just a quick chart that shows income growth. So everybody talks about median income growth, but or mean income growth. The mean household, or the mean person in our society doesn't exist. Okay, I think that's really something we need to keep in mind. We need to think about the distribution, how it's the economy is or is not working for different segments of our population. And of course, looking across the income distribution is just one way. We can be looking across other groups, such as racial groups as well. But here we see that we have basically stagnant income growth for the bottom half of the income population. So clearly, there's a large segment of our population that's not gaining from the current structure of the economy. Just one other thing I wanted to point out is we have this fantastic narrative around pulling yourself up by the bootstraps here in America. Right? We have this great narrative of it. If you just work hard, you're going to get ahead. If you just get the right education, you're going to get ahead. And we know that that's simply a farce. So here I used 2014 CIT data to break down levels of wealth by white and black households. And what we basically see is that whites, for instance, with a high school diploma, or even for that matter, less than a high school diploma, have more wealth than black households with a four-year college degree. So this narrative that if you work hard and you do the right things, you get the right credentials, is not working for large segments of people that we should be concerned about. And when we're thinking about how we should restructure the economy, I want to posit that I think we should be considering how is it that we achieve reasonable gains, in particular for the least well-off in our society. So I don't need to preach to this room that it's time for bold change. However, I do think that we want to consider broadly what we could envision a progressive party agenda to look like. I really encourage you to go back and look at the economic platform in the Democratic National Committee platform from the 30s through the 70s. And you see a relatively, almost a radical document. I mean, it's really quite impressive. I mean, the job guarantee was something that was explicitly in the Democratic Party's platform up until '72, as a matter of fact. But they had other things about rights to housing, rights to health care, rights to child care, and things of this nature that have all been systematically stripped out over the years. On the right, we have a very concentrated effort to build a long-term vision and agenda. But I don't see an agenda on the left. I don't see a vision of what we should and could be working towards on the left. And if Obama represented change and a vision for a progressive America, I'm not sure that's a progressive America I want to live in the very least. So I think that we need to broadly redefine it. And as we've talked about here, modern monetary theory, I think, should be a critical part of developing what that is. And so far, we've spent a lot of our time and attention on the job guarantee. But I just want to encourage us to think about what are the other complementary policies that we should be considering to go along with it. So one aspect that I actually really love about the job guarantee, and I think is particularly powerful when we're talking with policymakers, is the fact that it's an all-American idea. Right? This has been part of the conversation since Huey Long, was picked up by FDR, was led by many others throughout the civil rights. And I'm not positing that it's an idea original to the US by any means, but it's an idea that has deep roots in our political history here. And I think that driving home that point is part of the developing the further discourse, so that people aren't simply attacking, aren't we just bringing Scandinavian socialism here? No, this is part of the discourse of this country and has been for a very long time. Back in 1944, FDR, in his final State of the Union, put forth a brilliant address that I really encourage you to all read if you haven't thus far. You can find it on the web, arguing for a second Bill of Rights, or what is also popularly known as an economic Bill of Rights. And this Bill of Rights basically argued that real freedom cannot be had until we meet the basic needs of all of our people. And he went on to outline what some of those basic needs might look like. And the six that he put forth, this is back in 44, where the first two can basically be taken jointly as what we propose as a modern day job guarantee, so right to employment at non-poverty wages. Next, we have a right to a decent home, basically arguing that everybody should have a right to housing, of course, right to medical care, right to protection in old age and sickness, which he to some degree achieved, and a right to a good education. And in the United States, I mean, at one point we didn't have a right to an education, and then we had a right to an education K through 8, and then we had a right to an education K through 10, and then we had a right to an education K through 12. Well, why not pre-K through college? I mean, those boundaries that we set, those are not some rules that were put forth by the gods. These are policy choices. These are intentionally set by the public discourse. That said, they're malleable, and we can change those, and we can extend them on either direction. However, I think that we want to consider how we can rewrite this economic Bill of Rights for a modern day economy for the 21st century, and what a future vision of work, as you were talking about earlier, could look like. So while this legacy was carried on after FDR passed away, he was not able to secure many of these rights. As we talk about the job guarantee, for instance, I do strongly believe he had a vision of making full employment programs through direct employment part of a long-term agenda, and he did envision actually making that law. However, as we know, in the failed 1945 Employment Act, that didn't quite happen, and then we had following legislations such as the 1946 bill, and then the Humphrey-Hawkins bill, none of which really delivered on the promise of permanent full employment that I think that FDR really sought. But an important development that I think we should continue to develop into the current narrative is the connection between economic rights and civil rights, and therefore also economic rights, civil rights, and basic human rights. And this was really developed by A. Philip Randolph and Bayard Rustin. If you haven't read the Freedom Budget that they've come out with, I mean, I really encourage you to do so. It's something that I've now promised myself every year during the budget process. I'm going to try to write a piece on what a freedom budget today might look like, because we need a counter narrative to the current budgetary process. And as we talk about through MMT, we know that the fiscal constraint isn't there. We have the keys to the printer. We just need to think about as a society how we want to organize our behavior and how we want to utilize the different resources we have. But money is not the resource constraint here. So we need to think about what that agenda is and then utilize our keys to that printer to achieve that. So in terms of rewriting it for the 21st century, the three things that I want to mention that I believe we should be adding are the right to basic banking and financial services, for one. So things like payday lenders, for instance, have been in the news a tremendous amount. Predatory lending. As a response, Misha Berdadaran has put forth that we should have a poor people's bank through a postal banking system. I think that's a decent idea, but I actually think the framing isn't quite right. I don't think we want to consider a poor people's bank. I think we want to think about the fact that, okay, we want to allow this private market to exist, and we want to regulate it from the top down, but we also want to compete from the floor up. And this is also how I broadly see the job guarantee intersecting here, right? It's placing a reasonable floor in the labor market to say that if the private sector wants to provide a job above and beyond what the job guarantee is offering, then so be it, and people can freely engage in those contracts. But it's drastically changing the power dynamics between labor and the employer. Similarly, if you have a public bank that's setting a basic floor in the basic banking market, it can set a floor in predatory lending and in basic finance. And it's one way to think of basically the CFPB is regulating from top down, but we also need to make sure that people have an alternative option. So recently the CFPB has really been going after payday lenders. However, the problem that I have there is it's predicated on the view that individuals are using these predatory lenders and they'd be better off if they didn't exist in the first place. Well, that's basically saying that these people are financially illiterate, right? That's basically saying we need to regulate these things out of existence because these people don't know how to make the right choices. Alternatively, what I think we need to posit is a right to basic banking services mean that people have a true alternative to go to, such as a public bank, that offers people the right to access to basic banking and checking services, by and large for free. Because at the end of the day, I don't think that individuals can be fully participating members of our society without access to basic banking services. Second, something we've talked about quite a bit at this conference is climate change, and I think we want to reorient towards a right to a safe and clean environment. In particular, rather than asking questions about how many lives might we save from these additional environmental regulations, we need to flip the conversation on the head and follow what is frequently used in Europe, the precautionary principle, and basically put those rights there first and then talk about, okay, well, how is it that we may allow for some justification to violate those rights? And then the third thing is a right to a meaningful endowment of resources as a birthright. So I forgot to mention at the beginning, this is all joint work with Sandy Darity and Derek Hamilton. This third one is something that they've been working on quite a bit. It's basically their policy to propose baby bonds in the United States, which is a payment to everybody as a birthright that they'll get when they turn roughly 18. I think there's still a lot of policy details that need to be developed here. But basically that everybody gets some form of an individual endowment of resources. If you're born into Bill Gates or Oprah Winfrey's family, it might be $500. If you're born into a lower class family without any significant endowment of resources that can be passed on intergenerationally, it might be upwards of around $50,000. The one thing I want to augment to that framing is that while I agree we need to build broad wealth, I also think we need to reduce the reliance on private wealth. Right now, private wealth has a tremendous impact on economic outcomes for individuals in the US. If you look in Germany, actually, they take quite a different view. They basically address the social insurance programs and basic economic necessities that they provide their citizens as trying to minimize the need for private wealth to accumulate opportunities and access opportunities in and out of the first place. So I think that we want to think about attacking wealth from the top, but also from minimizing the needs and minimizing the connection between wealth and future outcomes. So I'll stop there. I'd be happy to elaborate on any of these further if folks are interested. But this is kind of my vision for rewriting an economic bill of rights for the 21st century and thinking about how we can set forth a broader platform that MMT can perhaps work on supporting so that we have shared economic growth and prosperity and ensure that employment is one vital intervention, but not the only one that we pursue. Thank you.
Okay, thank you. And finally, we have Voracek on Employ Young Americans Now, Beyond Education.
I'm just going to stay sitting. Okay, so this was my master's thesis from the Levy Economics Institute, and I think that I really wanted to look at, so growing up in an American high school, you always hear this narrative like education is going to be enough for poverty, education is going to get us through all of our problems, it'll get you out of poverty. And so I kind of wanted to look at that. And I mean, broadly, you can see here that like Americans have been, since 1940s, we've been getting more educated. Like our education levels have been increasing by a lot. Like around, by the 90s, almost everyone has a high school education. And then people start going on to getting college educations. And so the education level broadly has increased. But then, so why has inequality since the 70s not increased? Like inequality, we've still become more unequal. So to me, I argue that this is a fallacy of composition to say, it's a fallacy of composition to say education is enough to reduce inequality, because while for an individual, it can increase your odds of employment and better incomes, at a societal level, education is not going to be the way we solve inequality and poverty, because it's like kind of an arms race to who has the most education. So people all get bachelor's degrees and everyone gets masters, everyone gets PhDs, and it really, like, we have to reframe it. We have to move from this everyone needs an education to everyone needs a job is kind of the argument I go for here from the research. And so I wanted to actually analyze a specific bill in the House just to kind of see what we could come up with. And so Bernie Sanders at the time was running, and he had this bill, Employ Young Americans Now, and so that's kind of what I wanted to analyze. I also, like, in Minsky has this quote, programs must be designed which hold out a promise of a useful and productive life for high school dropouts, and that kind of went into the framing of my research. So this specific bill that I chose to analyze was introduced by Conyers in the House and Sanders in the Senate in this Congress, and it creates a fund in the Treasury, initially endowed with $5.5 billion to directly employ young Americans. There's no pay for taxes specifically in the bill. It's just an employment appropriations bill. It makes call-outs to hire youth in local government and nonprofit that serve their local communities or high-demand occupations. And it also kind of makes the argument that if these jobs are more apprenticeships in order to gain skills, they should be paid in order to be learning those skills. So the specifics of the bill, it kind of just lays out how the money goes to each state. So here's an analysis of, so these are the states are shaped by how much youth unemployment is in each state, and then the shading is kind of how much funding. So California has the population is also the highest, but it also has a higher percentage of unemployed, disadvantaged youth, and so California gets most of the funds. How much, the bill basically just specifies rules based on levels of poverty in children for how much money goes into each state, but that's about as far as it goes for targeting. So I wanted to examine what would the possibilities of targeting this bill be. So typically job policies like this, direct employment policy, analysis, microdata, you kind of do this regression and come up with a likelihood of employment based on skills, race, gender. And so I took these likelihoods, and you can see this is how likely it is for young people in certain race and education levels to be employed. So black people with less than a high school degree, they're only 16% chance they're employed. And for white people, it's higher, about double. And so then I wanted to give a range of possibilities for how this bill could be implemented, and then make an argument that we should actually target this employment to high school dropouts, essentially, if we want to move towards if we want to fight poverty and inequality. So I took a few different plans. So, you could, using those employment likelihoods that I generated from a regression, you can kind of impute who's likely to get jobs based on this program, and you can do it, if we use the same standards for hiring that we do normally, then the highest likelihood people will get employed. And but I argue that we could actually design this program, like Minsky argued, to employ the least likely, so to speak, of being employed. So we could actually design the program to employ people and train them on the job and give them the skills they need to go back to work. I mean, you kind of have to go into the sociology research to understand why people drop out of high school, but even in my own experience, I grew up in a suburban town of LA, and a lot of the people I know who dropped out of high school, there's outside societal resource constraints that cause a lot of people to not be able to stay in school if you have to support a younger sibling or support other family members. So that's kind of part of the motivation for saying, we can design this program to employ high school dropouts, give them an income, give them a chance to get some stuff together with their lives, and then maybe go back to school or gain more skills. So then you can kind of look under these different plans of who would get employed. So if you go with the highest likelihood employment scheme, you're going to end up employing a lot more white people and a lot less black people. And then if you look at other schemes using the least likely to be employed, you end up employing a lot more black people and people of color than you do white people, which kind of makes sense. Okay, so then after they get these jobs, now they have incomes, and I kind of looked at how does the poverty gap change under each of these plans. So the poverty gap doesn't. So if you hire it's kind of paradoxical, but it makes sense. If you hire the least likely to be employed people, give them incomes, the poverty gap doesn't decrease as much, but that's because the income of the proposal isn't necessarily enough to lift them above the poverty line. So, so my results showed that using this money to employ young people, it was only 5.5 billion, but that would employ about 11% of disadvantaged, not employed youth. So you can take that to the next step, and if we appropriated 55 billion, we could essentially end youth unemployment in this country. The research I go through kind of shows how focus on education isn't going to solve poverty, isn't going to solve inequality. We really need a focus on direct job creation, and even if acquiring skills is part of that job. And so the democratic slogan of better skills, better jobs, better wages is really kind of scary for a lot of us young people, because we feel like we have skills. A lot of us have been to college, and a lot of my friends with super high skills are still working low skill service jobs and things like that. So that was kind of my results. It was simple, short master's thesis, not like a PhD or anything. But then I just wanted to show some of these other direct job creation bills that are out there right now. So Employ Young Americans Now is the one I analyzed. Actually, in the couple days since I submitted, there's been another co-sponsor in the Senate. Ivanov of Michigan has also signed on to this campaigning bill in the Senate. And then there's some other ones, like there's a youth corps, there's a youth summer jobs program, and then there's this one, Jobs for All by Conyers, which is a much more elaborate program, HR 1000. And the slide is kind of cut off, but I thought it was interesting. There's kind of two 21st century civilian conservation corps proposals, one from a Democrat and one from a Republican. So that kind of shows, I think, that a service framing for these kind of jobs can have a broad, across the aisle support. If you frame it as serving your community, then there actually is a bill from a Republican that is direct job creation in a service frame. So if you're serving your community, you can. It's likely to have broad support in America, I think. And then there's just some further reading. Like Umbrellas Don't Make It Rain, Why Studying Working Hard Isn't Enough for Black Americans, Hamilton and Darity, and then the education system. Tressie McMillan Cotton has a great book called Lower Ed, and that kind of goes into how our debt financing of college has kind of produced these these schools that aren't really serving people for income mobility, as Mark kind of talked on. And then you can go all the way back to Veblen, the higher learning in America, to understand how universities aren't really going to serve the purpose of reducing inequality and poverty.
Okay, thank you very much. We can take some questions from the audience, maybe a couple at a time. Mike, do they need to speak into this?
It'd probably be better. Yeah.
My question is to Rosen or the European Union is a group of sovereign states that have effectively given up their sovereign currency, which is fundamental to MMT. My question is this an impediment to the implementation of the job guarantee?
Maybe I can use my privilege as a chair to ask a question on each presentation, and then give the audience opportunity to think about other questions. For Rosen, my question was, is 8 million too small a number for the European zone? The Eurozone population is comparable to US population, and the unemployment rate is much higher than the United States. We estimate about 20 million, the need for 20 million full-time jobs in the United States. So I'm thinking of all the structural problems that you mentioned, and people outside of the labor force, maybe 8 million is a small number. For Yeva, I agree with your point that we don't have to assume the job guarantee is a low-skill venture, that it actually can teach people some very useful skills for the future, especially in the green economy. Now, how does that then play with our claim that the job guarantee provides a base wage And is there a tension there about providing high skills and then paying $25,000 a year? For Mark, I really like the issues of framing that the poor, our focus on the poor might actually serve a little bit of a sabotage to the program. So it's so important that these programs are anti-poverty, but it seems that they garner less support if this is sort of the frame. So like how do we, I like the economic bill of rights because it's the right to every person, but then, like how do we bring in the poverty concerns without sort of stigmatizing the program? And finally for Brad, so interesting, I don't know if you're familiar with the youth entitlement program from the 80s, that they had some really fantastic results. Like speaking of a true American concept, the job guarantee, in the 80s we had these youth guarantees that reduced this black-white differentials, increased employment in the black youth community by 100%. I mean, really fantastic results. So we should bring these into our, proposals, policy proposals. And I'm curious, like, why are some having like 160 co-sponsors, and like, what is it in there that makes it so popular? And do they all have like a direct employment component, like the very popular ones that have a lot of co-sponsors? So let's just start from there and get more questions. Any comments?
On the question of giving up monetary policies over equity, indeed they have given it up, but in the end they have the fiscal policies over equity. If you allow this exception for job guarantee, if you allow the governments to borrow for this specific program, that this is an exception to the Stability and Growth Pact, then I think they have enough fiscal space. They will have enough fiscal space to do this job guarantee. And we at least in MMT, we understand that fiscal policies actually do matter quite a bit. So they do matter for inflation and for all that. So basically, with the open-ended job guarantee Eurozone, each country would have a targeted fiscal policy according to its own situation. Because if you allow it to fluctuate according to the need of the economy, basically you have a way actually to even out all these differences, even in the framework of a common monetary policy. I mean, this is my understanding of these things, how actually fiscal policy could step in, especially this type of policy, and then actually that's a way to complement what is being currently done now. Is that okay?
From both point of view, you said the sovereign state would retain a debt. I assume to the central currency provider was ignorant as to how the structure works. In Australia, for instance, would spend money to employ the people, there'd be no debt as such to pay back. Based on what you said there, the sovereign state would still have a debt to repay to somebody, which essentially would be an impediment, especially to something like Greece, who has a greater problem than perhaps other people in the Union.
Yeah. I don't know.
Common funds will solve the problem.
A common fund could solve the problem. But I mean, the support of the European Central Bank would say if you have if you have a support that these bonds will be bought at all times. So you will have all the time this guarantee that there will be funds available always. So even if it's by the debt market and so on, that there would be these funds available, and then what I've shown is actually debt to GDP ratio would decrease. So it would not be a burden for the future, I would say.
Is 8 million too small?
Yeah, 8 million too small. Okay. I admit you have a point there, but okay, this is the official number of unemployed, and okay, I'm talking about the long-term unemployed. I assume that all the long-term unemployed self-select themselves. Now, the inactivity, together taking also the inactive population, there was a recent estimate by this European agency, which is Eurofund, and in August they came with a figure of 50 million. But then again, this is a voluntary self-selecting program. Probably people who are relatively better off, they will not self-select themselves for minimum salary. And then the other thing is you have much more general benefits in Europe. So if you get like half a minimum salary without working, let's say, do you want to take a part-time job and get the same money? So it's kind of, I could imagine that we could go double that, like maybe we could go to 20 million or even 30 million. But again, the cost is would be for every 10 million, like 1% of GDP roughly. So even if you go to 30 million, you would have 3% of GDP. So I think it's very reasonable, and that's a gross estimate. So it would be much lower than that.
Plus the private sector jobs, I guess you could say, if you start with something. Yeah. So I think one way to answer your question, Pavlina, would be to say, well, we do need to raise the minimum wage, right? So the 5 for 15, or campaign for raising it to 15, and $15 an hour would be, of course, much better than what we have today. So in that sense, you could use the job guarantee, and at that point, you don't even need the minimum wage, right? That would be your minimum wage. But I think it's also worth thinking about having sort of some differentials even within a job guarantee in terms of skill. And the reason why I say this is because, I used to say, well, these jobs that are polluting are crappy jobs, but then somebody said, yeah, but you get like $150,000 to drive a truck in like for an oil company. And so then how do you compete with that, right? How do you sort of drive out those jobs and replace them with, like, you pay somebody $15 an hour to build a wind turbine? So I think if you sort of keep the eye on the goal, which for me would be to sort of fight climate change and maybe build renewables, so at some point we can drive out the oil will not be necessary anymore. At that point, you can think of sort of having some variation. But I mean, right, in that sense, so I would, in general, we think of the job guarantee as not wanting it to disrupt the private sector, right? I think in case of polluting industries, I say we should disrupt the polluting industries. So that would be my, my take on it.
Thanks for that question, Pavlina. And I agree. I mean, I think that it's a hard question here. But what I come to is I broadly argue that we should be considering universal policies as opposed to means testing. And this is a discussion that I've had with many friends and colleagues, and is deeply entrenched in the current way Democrats think about things. It is, of course, deeply entrenched in how neoclassical economics frames things. We've got a lot of pushback about this. People say, well, okay, if resources are scarce, we need to make sure we're targeting the least well-off. We have to best target these programs. No, we need to set reasonable floors. However, we want to be conscious that these policies are disproportionately benefiting the least well-off. So through ensuring that they're targeted universalist policies, they're policies that are open and available to all, but are going to be primarily utilized by the least well-off in society, or at least will disproportionately benefit those individuals. So I mean, the biggest policy in the U.S. that is virtually untouchable is Social Security, of course. And we know that Social Security disproportionately benefits the poor. That Social Security, drastically decreased poverty amongst elderly. Right? It didn't so much raise the living standards of the rich elderly, but it certainly nearly eliminated elderly poverty in the U.S. Of course, it's insufficient, but it's one policy I think we should look towards in terms of how is it that we provide economic security for certain segments of our population that might be vulnerable, but ensure that it's politically resilient. And I think that, I really love Brad's presentation, and for instance, targeting disconnected youth might be a great way to try to show the merits of a program like the job guarantee. And of course, I don't want to necessarily argue that we should be targeting the job guarantee, but at the same time, I think there's a tremendous amount of strength that we could garner from having a pilot program, such as starting with some segment of the population. Thanks.
Thanks for your question. I hadn't heard of the youth entitlement program, so I'll definitely look into that. It sounds cool. In terms of guessing why bills have the most co-sponsors, that's pretty tough, but I think I would guess the one with the most co-sponsors is the Action for National Service Act, and I think this supports it's called the CNCS, which has like AmeriCorps in it and other programs. But I would guess that since they're employed in local government offices on both sides of the aisle, they use these programs. So I think that it's just the very fact that they become reliant on these programs continues the support for them. So I think expanding them could be a way to move towards a type of job guarantee. Getting them more visible, more heard of, can help people understand that yes, the government can create jobs. Yes, this is something we can do, and we can go further than we currently are. So.
Any other questions?
Just a quick comment on Pavlina's point about the wages in the job guarantee and setting a minimum wage for skilled workers. I mean, a good way to think about this is in terms of the metaphor that we use about the buffer stock. So the buffer stock for corn and buffer stock for wheat and buffer stock for coffee, these are separate markets, separate products, and separate buffer stock interventions. So we don't have a macro buffer stock for all commodities. In the same way in the labor market, skilled workers and unskilled workers and semi-skilled workers are not competing for the same jobs. So we should think of the failure of the private sector to provide skilled work, the failure of the private sector to provide semi-skilled and unskilled work, and treat them as separate buffer stocks within the broader job guarantee system. So we have a buffer stock for each category.
How many?
As many as we can think of.
Oh,
So
okay. So
at
here-
least,
so
at
then
least skilled, semi-skilled, and
No work is
unskilled.
unskilled.
I'm sorry?
No work is unskilled.
Right. I mean, you know what I mean, in terms of the
What is-
segregation of the labor market. And then think of different wages for different categories and different interventions for transitioning workers into the private sector. Because it's not the same macro market.
Okay.
That's my
Well, there's a
thought.
big, yeah. Okay.
I'm going to sort of shake things up and give a different perspective. In the 1940s, the 40-hour work week standard was established. And since then, productivity has more than quadrupled. So that means we can be working 10 hours a week to have the same productive capacity as we had back then.
But we're working more.
I realize it's not a practical possibility, but a practical possibility is to reduce work hours by 10%. And that increases employment by 10%, assuming that productivity doesn't change, which it would. When you reduce people's work hours, they tend to be more productive. So instead of increasing employment by 10%, it might increase it by 9%, which is an enormous amount. And then obviously you can't force employers to pay the same amount to people that are getting 10% less work hours from them. So you increase the income tax credit. So that the amount of wages that people get reduced is supported by the government. And then you don't need a jobs program. You don't need any kind of infrastructure for a jobs program because you've already established 9% more workforce. You already-
I'll let the panel answer this because I'm sure I can provide an answer, but I would love to hear your thoughts.
They did reduce the work week in France to, they did reduce the work week in France to 35 hours, and that did not create more employment. I mean,
It did not create more.
no, they still have the 10%, I mean, they're stuck at 10% unemployment, so that has not
Well,
been.
it's different from what it was. I mean, it was probably 20% before, and now it's 10%.
No, it was not 20% before. So that, I think when we think of working fewer hours, one thing that I would advocate for, I don't think we need to think of it as a way to create jobs. We just need to think of it as a way to, we need more time to do other things because, rather than just work, like live to work sort of, which is what Americans
Well, how are
tend to
those
do.
work hours made up? If people are
A job
working less
here-
hours per person, then they can't produce as much goods and services.
Well, you just said that if they work less, they will be more productive. So you just said that, right? If they work fewer hours, they will be more productive. But productivity isn't necessarily an individual thing. It depends on capital. So if you do invest in capital, you do invest in research and development, you are going to make people more productive.
So if people are going to be more productive
Yes.
in the amount that the work hour does, why are people working less hours in the first place? I mean, obviously,
enjoy more
if
leisure.
they're producing during the hours they're there, or the employer wouldn't be paying them for the hours they're there.
So I'm all for reducing work hours. I think that this is a policy that we should certainly consider. However, I by no means think it comes anywhere close to eliminating the need nor the benefits to direct job creation programs such as a job
No, I'm not
guarantee.
against that.
Yeah, that's so. I think that we can find common ground. I think the job guarantee is one area where we can think about how is it that labor can start considering reducing work hours. We can use the job guarantee for that. The job guarantee sets a floor in the labor market. So if we want to say that people can earn a non-poverty wage with benefits for working 30 hours a week, the government can and should determine to do so. The other thing that I would mention is the case of Germany. And again, these are two separate policies that I think both should be considered and hopefully implemented. In Germany, though, we had broad work sharing during the Great Recession. Germany had a deeper recession than the United States did. However, their unemployment rate fell. In France, the dynamics are different, right? There's not a policy that you're going to have the exact same outcomes when you have different case scenarios. So we have two different scenarios, and I'm not as familiar with the French case. I know the headlines, but you know the policy can indeed lead to increased employment if we're holding other things constant, but it doesn't necessarily have to. So it's definitely a great way to improve worker standards is by using the job guarantee to improve other aspects of workers' lives beyond just a wage. So wage is one dimension to what I would deem to be a just job, but it's not the only dimension.
But I think if you look at Germany, if you just look at work number of hours rather than like number of people employed, maybe, you know, yes, everybody was employed, but everybody was working fewer hours, right?
Yes,
Something like that.
they
So-
brought everybody's hours
Yeah.
down, and they also brought their compensation down.
Right.
Yeah.
So they did, you know, people were still making less because of that.
Oh, absolutely.
They're
Yeah,
still
no,
unemployed.
there was an income shock, but
So-
this doesn't by any, this cannot solve the problem of unemployment.
Right, right.
They're just two separate issues. It might be able to marginally reduce unemployment, but it can't solve the problem of unemployment. I mean, show me a time where we've had full employment in the U.S. We've had full employment, I'd argue, for 3 years, which was during the war era when unemployment averaged 1.7%. You know, I view for me the full employment rate is somewhere around 1 or 2%, just minor frictional unemployment.
All right, well, let's take our panel.